I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The old truck rattling down the road like it was ready to fall apart, just like everything else. Killingly loomed ahead, its black frame cutting against the dull morning sky. I could feel the anger rising again, the same as it did every bloody day now. They were shutting us down, shutting everything down. I parked up in the dirt lot, staring at the colliery ahead. Killingly Colliery, last of its kind, last of our kind. The old man worked these pits, his old man before him too. Now they were telling us it had to end, that it was time to move on. Move on to what exactly? I slammed the door shut harder than I needed to and shoved my hands into my pockets, walking towards the others. "All right, Ross," called out Dave, leaning against the fence. I nodded, though I wasn't. Dave knew it. Everyone did. "You hear that last night?" I muttered, joining him and a couple of the other lads. 6 months. That's it. They're saying we've got 6 months till we're out of here on our asses. Pete, always the optimist, shook his head with a sigh. "They've been saying that for years, mate. It's not like it's a surprise." "Surprise or not, doesn't make it any easier," I shot back. "What are we supposed to do after? Sit around collecting dole, is that it?" Pete scratched his chin, calm as ever. "You know it's got to happen, Russ. The mines, they're not what they used to be. World's changing. Gotta change with it." I stared at him, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Maybe, but not like this. They're just throwing us away like we're nothing. Dave, who'd been quiet, finally spoke. "We're not nothing. But it's not like we can dig forever. There's nothing left down there. And what's left ain't worth the cost." I looked away, the pit's head frame towering over us, a ghost of what it used to be. It didn't matter what they said. None of this sat right with me. I stood there, staring out at the entrance to the mine, the towering black frame of the headgear casting long shadows over the car park. The metal beams stretched up into the grey sky like skeleton fingers, reaching for something long gone. The winding gear, once alive with a constant grind and hum, was silent now, save for the occasional creak in the wind. The cages that used to haul us down into the belly of the earth were still, like a part of history, frozen time. Beyond the pit entrance, the field stretched out, rolling into the distance under layers of mist. What used to be green had turned into a dirty patchy brown, stained by years of soot and coal dust that hung in the air. The trees were sparse, their leaves dull as if they'd given up fighting against the grime long ago. A few scraggly sheep dotted the horizon, picking at the tough grass that grew between the patches of dirt. You'd think in a place like this, nature would have come back by now. But even the land seemed as tired and worn out as we were. The old railway tracks, rusted and half buried in the ground, ran alongside the pit, disappearing into the distance. Trains used to come and go, full of coal back when this place had life. Now, all that was left were the echoes of better days, carried away by the cold wind. It was hard to look at. Everything seemed so still, like it was waiting for the end, just like we were. The mine was more than just a job, it was a way of life. Everything that grounded us, gave us purpose. Without it, I wasn't sure what would be left of any of us. We made our way toward the gear room, the cold biting through my jacket. The familiar clang of boots against metal steps echoed as we filed in, the air thick with the smell of grease and sweat. I yanked my hard hat off the rack, turning it over in my hands, the scratches and dents a testament to the years I'd spent down there. Dave pulled on his boots beside me, lacing them up tight like he had always done, methodical, while Pete leaned against the lockers, shaking his head like he had something to say but was holding back. "What's on your mind, Pete?" I asked, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice. Pete glanced at me, then at the others before sighing. "I've been thinking about Jerry," he said, voice low but steady. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Jerry. I hadn't thought about him in a while. Not really. Not since that day. Pete shifted, his face drawn. "Look, Russ, I get it. I get the anger, the frustration. But after what happened to Jerry, maybe it's time we admit this work's too dangerous. Not just for us, for anyone." I grunted, pulling on my boots and avoiding his eyes. It was a freak accident. Could have happened anywhere. "Wasn't a freak accident," Pete said, softer now. "It's the nature of the job. This work, Russ. It's outdated. Mines like this shouldn't even exist anymore. You know that as well as I do." I stood up, zipping up my jacket and shaking my head. "What, so you're saying he deserved it? That it's all our fault for staying down here too long?" "Of course not," Pete replied, a flicker of frustration in his voice. "Jerry was one of the best blokes I've ever known. But it's the system. The danger was always there, and we're just too stubborn to see it." Dave, standing between us, nodded silently. "Remember when they sent that safety report in last year? Said supports were weakening. We shrugged it off. We kept going." I clenched my fists, the memory of Jerry's last shift flashing in my mind. The sound of the collapse, the dust, the frantic shouting, and the silence that followed. He didn't deserve to go like that. None of us did. But what the hell were we supposed to do? This was all we knew. Pete folded his arms, watching me. "It's not just about the climate, Russ. Yeah, the world's moving on from coal. But it's this too. The danger, the deaths. It's not worth it anymore." I swallowed hard, staring at my helmet as if it held the answers. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But another part of me, one I hated to admit, knew he had a point. Jerry's death wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last either, if we stayed down there long enough. "We're not like them," I muttered, looking up at Pete. "The ones in the suits, the ones making all these decisions. They don't know what it's like." Pete met my gaze, his eyes softer than I'd seen in a while. "No, they don't. But maybe they're right about this one. Maybe it's time to stop risking everything for something that's already fading." I shoved my helmet under my arm, glancing out toward the far side of the yard. There they were again, half a dozen or so blokes in suits, clipboards in hands, talking amongst themselves like they had some grand plan we weren't a part of. I'd noticed them hanging around more and more lately, all polished shoes and tight lips, keeping their distance from the rest of us like they didn't want to get their fancy clothes dirty. I nudged Dave. "What's with all the suits? Been seeing a lot of them around lately." Dave barely looked up from tying his laces, giving a half-hearted shrug. "Just the usual, I reckon. Some kind of changeover business. Management or health or safety, you know the drill." Pete chimed in, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Probably finalising all the shutdown procedures. Meetings, paperwork, whatever it is they do. Same thing happened at the last bits that closed down." I frowned, my eyes lingering on the group. They were too close to the pit entrance for it to just be paperwork. Something about it didn't sit right with me. They weren't checking equipment or talking to the foreman. They were just watching, like vultures circling, waiting for something. I don't know, I muttered. It feels off, doesn't it? Like they're planning something that they're not telling us about. Pete gave a tired chuckle, smacking me on the back. Mate, they've been planning to screw us over for years. This ain't news. Yeah, but why now? I pressed, watching the men laugh at something, like they didn't have a care in the world. They've been saying we've got 6 months left, but I don't buy it. Something's happening, something behind the scenes, and we're always the last ones to know. Dave rolled his eyes. Russ, you're overthinking it. They're just suits. They don't give a toss about us. They're here to make sure the whole thing wraps up smooth. Nothing more, nothing less. But I couldn't shake it. I'd been around long enough to know when something wasn't right. The air felt heavier these days, like there was more than just the weight of coal dust hanging over us. Maybe it was the closure looming over our heads. Or maybe it was the way those blokes looked at the mine, like it was already dead. Either way, I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my gut. They're up to something, I muttered again, more to myself this time. Pete raised an eyebrow. Even if there were, what difference does it make? This place is shutting down whether we like it or not. Whatever's coming, we're just along for the ride. I nodded, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at me as we finished gearing up, and I couldn't shake the thought that we were missing something. Something big. We descended into the mine, the cage rattling as it plunged us deeper than we'd been in weeks. The hum of machinery grew fainter, replaced by the heavy silence of the earth pressing in from all sides. Pete stood next to me, his helmet light casting faint circles on the shaft walls as we descended. My own headlamp flickered across the walls, the jagged rocks shimmering under the harsh glare. Deepest we gone yet? Pete muttered, pulling at his collar as the air grew colder, thicker. Don't reckon we'll be coming down here much longer anyway. I grunted in reply, my mind elsewhere. There was something about today that didn't sit right. Not just the suits up top or the feeling that everything was coming to an end. It was something else. Something I just couldn't shake. The air felt too still, too quiet down here. As the cage clattered to a stop at the lowest level, we stepped out, our boots crunching on the gravel as we made our way down the tunnel. The lights ahead flickered on and off, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Pete walked a few paces ahead, whistling softly to himself, like he always did when he hit the deep shifts. But I wasn't whistling. I kept turning my head, feeling a cold prickling at the back of my neck like someone was watching me. We were the only ones down here, though. No one else was scheduled for this section. Hell, no one wanted to be down here this deep anymore. It was just us, the rock and the echoes of our footsteps. Or at least that's what it should have been. As we turned another corner, the feeling hit me again, stronger this time. I stopped, shining my torch down the tunnel behind us. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the bare walls, the rusty support beams, and the tunnel stretching off into the void. Russ, you all right? Pete called from up ahead, his voice echoing. I blinked, shook my head, and hurried to catch up. Yeah, fine, I said, though I knew I wasn't. We walked on for a while longer, the walls closing in tighter the deeper we went. But then, just as I rounded another bend, my headlamp caught something. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of the light. A figure, disappearing into the shadows further down the tunnel. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Pete? I called out, my voice low. He turned around, shining his light in my direction. What is it? I saw someone," I said, my heart thudding in my chest. Pete frowned, looking past me into the darkness. "Saw who? There's not supposed to be anyone down here, just us." "I know," I muttered, still scanning the darkness. "But I saw something. Someone. Just walking down there." Pete sighed, shaking his head. "You seeing things, mate? Could be the dust. Could be the shadows playing tricks. You know how it gets down here." But I knew what I saw. I wasn't losing it. I wasn't seeing shadows. I caught a glimpse of a man, plain as day, moving further into the tunnel. And whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be down here. Pete clapped me on the shoulder. "Yeah, man. Let's get this done and get out of here. You're probably just jumpy from all the talk up top. We'll be out this hole soon enough." I nodded, trying to shake the feeling. But as we headed deeper into the mine, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, my heart pounding louder than the echo in our footsteps. The further we went, the stronger that sense of being watched became. Working this deep down, everything feels heavier. The air, the silence, even the weight of the rock above me. First thing I always do is check the walls, tap them a few times, listen for anything that sounds off. You get a feel for it after a few years down here. I've learnt to hear when something's shifting or ready to give way. It's second nature now, though that doesn't mean it doesn't send a chill down my spine every time. Pete and I get to the coal face, and the first job is setting up the cutter. It's a beast of a machine, and you have to be careful with it. I line it up, check the connections, and make sure the power's solid. You don't want this thing malfunctioning when it's already halfway through a seam. When it's ready, I hit the switch, and the cutter's teeth bite into the coal face, sending chunks flying, dust thickening the air. The sound's deafening, like the earth's groaning from what we're doing to it. Once the machine's done its part, I grab the shovel. Nothing fancy, just me and the coal, tossing it into the conveyor belt that'll carry it back to the surface. Pete's busy handling the props, setting them up to keep the ceiling from caving in on us whilst we work. Every now and then the roof groans, and we pause, looking at each other to make sure we're hearing the same thing. Down here, every noise can set your nerves on edge. We have to stop every so often too, check the air, make sure the gas levels aren't creeping up. One wrong move, one missed reading, and it could be the end of us. The deeper we go, the slower we work, always taking breaks to make sure the equipment's not failing, that the supports are holding, and that nothing's about to come crashing down. It's dirty, back-breaking work, but it's all I know. Every shovelful of coal feels like we're fighting against the earth itself, and there's no telling how much longer we can keep at it down here. About a half an hour into the work, my mind was on autopilot. Shoveling, setting the cutter, checking the props. Same routine I'd done 1,000 times. The only sounds were the clink of coal on metal and the hum of the machine as it chewed into the rock. The dust was thick enough to choke, but you get used to it. My head was down, focused, when I felt it before I heard it. A deep, low rumble coming from below. I stopped mid-shovel, heart skipping a beat. Pete must have felt it too because he froze, the cutter going silent as he shut it off. We both stood there, listening, ears straining against the thick silence that followed. I glanced at him, my hand tightening on the shovel. The rumble came again, this time clearer, like it was rising up from the very bottom of the earth. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice tight. Pete didn't answer right away, just nodded, his eyes wide, scanning the walls and ceiling. We both knew what that sound could mean. Shifting rock, the kind that signals a cave-in. But this wasn't the usual creaking or groaning. No, this was something else. It was too rhythmic, too steady, like breathing. The rumble pulsed again, deep and slow, like the earth itself was drawing breath under our feet. "What the hell is that?" Pete muttered, stepping closer, his voice barely more than a whisper now. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. The ground seemed to tremble ever so slightly beneath us, like something massive was stirring below. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but we were miles under the ground, nowhere to go but deeper into the dark. "It's coming from below," I said, my voice barely carrying in the stale air. Pete took a few steps back, his lamp flashing down the tunnel as if expecting to see something rise out of the shadows. "Can't be gas, can it?" His voice wavered, trying to make sense of it like I was. I wanted to tell him it was just the earth shifting, that it was normal, but I couldn't. The sound, the breathing, it was too real, too unnatural. It felt like we weren't alone down here, like something far deeper, far older was waking up. The rumbling finally stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the mine in a heavy, suffocating silence. Pete and I stood there for a long time, neither of us daring to speak. Then Pete let out a nervous laugh, the kind that comes when you don't know what else to do. "Bloody hell," he chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Feels like we've gone dug straight into the devil's bedroom, doesn't it?" I managed a weak laugh in return, trying to shake off the tension. "Yeah, reckon he wasn't too happy about it either." We exchanged nervous glances, both trying to pretend we weren't rattled. And I turned back to the coalface, ready to get back to work. But the second I swung the torch around, I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Standing inches from me, his face gaunt and hollow, was Jerry. His eyes, sunken and lifeless, stared into mine with a look that made my blood run cold. His skin, pale and drawn tight over his bones, looked as if they hadn't seen daylight in years. His lips were cracked, barely clinging to the face I once knew. But this wasn't the Jerry I'd worked with. This was something else. Something wrong. I tried to move, to speak, but the words caught in my throat as Jerry leaned in closer, his breath cold against my cheek. I could feel the icy weight of his hand as it gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in like a vice. My body went rigid, a chill spreading through me from where he touched, as though the warmth of life was being sucked right out of me. He leaned closer still, his mouth by my ear, and in a voice barely more than a rasp, he whispered, "Don't wake it." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could hear were those words echoing in my mind, and the cold grip of his hand tightening on my shoulder. And then, in a blink, he was gone. I stumbled backwards, landing on my arse, the pain barely registering as I stared in disbelief at the spot where Jerry had just been. My scream tore through the silence of the mine, raw and panicked, echoing off the walls. Pete's eyes were wide, locked on the same empty space, his mouth hanging open in shock. He'd seen it too. I could tell by the way he froze in place, the color drained from his face. Did you see that?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Pete's gaze shifted to me, then back to where Jerry had stood. He nodded slowly, the movement jerky and disbelieving. "Yeah, I saw it, Ross. I bloody saw it." Neither of us could quite process what had just happened. We sat there staring at the empty tunnel, trying to convince ourselves that that was some kind of hallucination or a trick of the light. But the cold, the chill that lingered on my shoulder told me otherwise. Jerry had been there. His gaunt, horrifying figure, his icy grip, his whisper. It was all too real. And now he was gone, leaving only the echo of his warning hanging in the stale air. What do we do? Pete finally stammered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to find the words. I don't know, Pete. I don't know. We sat there in the dark, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. The mind felt different now, more oppressive, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of our lamps. The rumble, the breathing, Jerry's ghost, everything seemed connected. And we were left with a sinking feeling that we were only scratching the surface of whatever was happening down here. As we turned to flee, Pete trips over a loose piece of debris, falling hard onto the rocky ground. In the chaos, his hand slammed against the control panel of the cutter, triggering the machine to start boring again. The sudden, unexpected motion jolted us both, and we rushed back, trying to shut it down. But it was too late. The cutter, relentless in its work, continued to grind into the coalface, the noise of the machine roaring to life, drowning out our shouts as we fumbled with the controls. Dust exploded from the cut, swirling around us as the cutter bored deeper and deeper. We watched in horror as the cutter's massive head broke through the wall of the tunnel. The machine lurched forward, tearing into a new chamber that had been hidden below us. For a split second, everything seemed to hang still. The cutter suspended in the air as it breached into the unknown. Then, with a deafening crash, the cutter plummeted through the newly created gap, falling into the chamber below. The impact was violent, a jarring shockwave that rippled through the mine. We waited, breathless, the roar of the machine still echoing in our ears, before we heard the sound of the cutter finally hitting something far below. The ground shook violently, as if the entire mine was convulsing. The roar that followed was unlike anything we'd heard before. Deep, cavernous, and impossibly loud. It resonated through the tunnels with a ferocity that made the walls tremble and the floor beneath us heave. The air around us seemed to pulse with the sound, a living force that seemed to awaken something massive and ancient below. We could hear whatever it was stirring, its movements causing a thunderous rumbling as it began to rise from its long slumber. Pete and I stared at each other, our faces drained of color. The very earth seemed to react to the intrusion, as if it was alive and angry. The roar grew more intense, a monstrous sound that seemed to shake the mind to its core. We knew, without a doubt, that whatever we had disturbed was now awake and furious. Panic surged through us, our only thought now to escape the wrath we had unwillingly unleashed. We scrambled towards the cage, the roar and the tremors growing ever more violent, the mine itself seeming to rebel against our presence. As the cage ascended, Pete and I clung to the rail, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The roar continued to echo through the tunnels, growing more intense with every passing second. Dust and debris swirled around us, thick and choking, as if the mine was trying to cover up the breach we had made. Through the haze and debris, I caught glimpses of something monstrous. The dust was so thick it was hard to see clearly, but through the swirling chaos I saw glistening fangs, massive, jagged teeth that shone with an unnatural sheen. They were part of a larger shape that was just beyond the reach of my headlamp, but the sight was enough to send ice running through my veins. Alongside the fangs, I saw rock-like scales, their surface rugged and dark, glowing with a faint magma-colored light. The glow pulsed through the dust like molten lava beneath a crust, shifting and undulating with a life of its own. The scales seemed to writhe and shift, as if the creature was pushing its way through the earth, trying to follow us. The tremors grew stronger as we ascended, the whole cage vibrating with the force of whatever was coming up behind us. The magma-colored glow grew brighter, cutting through the dust like a searing, fiery beacon. It was clear that whatever we had unleashed was massive. Every so often the debris would clear just enough to catch another glimpse. Sharp, glistening teeth, rock-like scales shifting, and that relentless, eerie glow, as if the creature was reaching out, trying to catch us before we could escape. "Faster!" Pete shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. "Come on, hurry up, you bastard!" My heart pounded in my chest as we gripped the railing tighter, desperate for the cage to reach the surface. Soon we saw the light of day, and before long, the cage finally jolted to a stop at the surface. Pete and I bolted out, adrenaline propelling us away from the entrance. We sprinted, not daring to look back until we reached a safe distance. We could hear the sound of metal and concrete being ripped apart behind us, the deafening roar of the creature tearing through the mine with a fury that shook the very ground. We stopped to catch our breath, the sight before us almost too surreal to process. Our fellow miners and crew who had gathered at a safe distance, seemingly notified to the danger by the creature's cacophonous shouts. Like us, they were staring wide-eyed at the wreckage. The once sturdy buildings and equipment were reduced to twisted metal and rubble, smoke billowing up into the sky. From amidst the devastation, a massive shape began to emerge. Rising out of the dust and debris, the creature was unlike anything we had ever seen. A colossal serpentine form that glowed with an eerie magma-colored light. Its scales shimmered with an unsettling brilliance, reflecting the last remnants of the sun's light. It unfurled two enormous bat-like wings, their span stretching far across the horizon. Its wings glowed with a fiery intensity, casting a bright, flickering light over the rubble. With a powerful beat, it lifted off the ground, sending a final shockwave through the air that nearly knocked us off our feet. We watched in stunned silence as the creature soared into the air, its massive wings propelling it upward through the thickening clouds. Its roar was both majestic and horrifying, a sound that resonated through our bones and left a lingering echo in the air. The serpentine body, glowing brightly, slowly vanished into the cloud layer, disappearing into the vast expanse of the sky. As the creature flew away, the roar faded into the distance, leaving us standing in stunned silence. The enormity of what we had witnessed was sinking in. The reality of having disturbed something so ancient and powerful was washing over us. We were left with the remnants of the destruction, the reality of that creature's power, and the haunting idea of what it was going to do next. Suddenly, the idea of losing my job didn't seem like the biggest problem in the world.